Okay, so that was the process. Now we're going to move on to conversation management. How do we manage our conversations? Well, we're going to basically look at more principles. We already looked at the principle of process in that segment, but now we're going to talk about managing your conversation and some more principles. The first principle that we're going to talk about is the principle of cooperation. Now, technically, this is the second because principle of process we already talked about, but this first principle of cooperation that allows us to manage our conversation has 4 aspects, and these 4 aspects are what you're going to be reviewing and writing about in your journal entry this week. So make sure that you spend some quality time here on page 204 and 205. Don't just listen to what I'm saying or look at the PowerPoint. Make sure you really read it. So there's 4 conversational maxims that make up the principle of cooperation, and they are the maxim of quantity, the maxim of quality, the maxim of relation, and the maxim of manner. So the principle of cooperation. So the maxim of quantity is what we're going to start with, and that basically means that you give just the right amount of information. You don't give too much information. You don't ramble on. You don't go on and on and on and on until people just want to put duct tape over your mouth. But you also don't give so few details that the person's wondering, well, what happened? Well, then what did they say? I don't get what went on at all. That wasn't enough information for me. The next is the maxim of quality, and that means that you say what you assume to be true. So you tell the truth in your conversations. In addition to telling the truth, you're going to avoid exaggerating. So do not exaggerate what happened or exaggerate your claims. And don't minimize major problems. That will be confusing and misleading. So be honest, don't exaggerate, and don't minimize major problems. The next maxim is the maxim of relation, and that means talk about what's relevant to the conversation. Don't go off on tangents where somebody's sitting there listening to you going, what does that have to do with what we're talking about? So if you're telling somebody, let's say your roommate, about how your boss totally chewed you out before lunch, and they say, yeah, I had this weird Chinese food today, you would be so taken aback because what does that have to do with your boss chewing you out? It's not related to the conversation you're having. Last but not least is the maxim of manner, and what that means is that I'm going to make sure that my listener understands by avoiding ambiguities. Ambiguities are unclear things. I'm going to be brief, and I'm going to organize my thoughts into a meaningful sequence. Now, don't confuse the brief maxim of manner, that you should be brief, with quantity, because quantity does have something to do with being brief, but the maxim of manner is more than just being brief. It's that when you're brief, you organize your ideas, and it also means that you simplify your vocabulary or clarify terms that your relational partner will maybe not understand. So that's what that maxim of manner is. When you're looking at those four for your journal entry, make sure you first give me a definition. What does it mean in your own words, much like you did on the Scream journal entry from chapter 7. So tell me, what is the maxim of quantity in your own words? Please don't just copy out of the textbook. Regurgitate it to me in your own words. And then explain specifically with actual quotes from your conversation what was said that either showed the maximum of quantity was being followed or shows that the maximum of quantity is being violated. The next principle is the principle of dialogue, and this is two-way interaction that also shows a concern for the other and a concern for the relationship. If we engage in a monologue, we are basically lecturing somebody else, and the other person isn't going to feel cared for. They're not going to feel like their opinion or their thoughts or ideas are valued. So you want to make sure that each person gets the opportunity to be the speaker, each person gets the opportunity to be a listener, and that the times of speaker to listener are relatively equal. That means if I speak 4 times, I listen 4 times, and if you speak 4 times, I listen 4 times. It shouldn't be I speak 10 times and you speak 2 times, because that doesn't encourage both people to participate. Now, sometimes you're talking to somebody and they're not a talker. They're not good at conversing with others, and that may need some finessing and some different kind of techniques that you've learned this semester, but for the most part we want to make sure that it's even. The next is the principle of turn taking, and that basically means that we're going to exchange roles, but we're also going to do things that indicate when we want to speak and when we want to listen. So speaker cues is when we say things like, and then. You may even use your hands to show that you're still telling your story, and that's turn maintaining cues. And what that means is I'm maintaining my turn as speaker. I'm not ready to be interrupted yet. Pay close attention to those if you want to be somebody who doesn't interrupt. Interruptions get very frustrating, and they say a lot about us and how we feel about the other person. So be careful about doing that. The other type of cue that a speaker can use is turn yielding, and that means, you know what, I'm done talking, and now I want to hear from you. Sometimes, again, it may be nonverbal. We just stop, and then we, with our hand, motion towards our own body to show, hey, why don't you have a turn? And sometimes we may say, so tell me, what happened to you today? And that means it's over. I'm done talking. Your turn is now here. Listener cues, turn requesting cues, are when I want to say something, but I don't want to interrupt. So I may open my mouth and put my finger up, my pointer finger up, to show I have something to say. Without interrupting, I may just indicate that. It's hard to do turn requesting without interrupting. You could say, make maybe a noise with your voice, but you want to avoid saying too much because you don't want to interrupt. And then turn denying, where you say, you know what, I'm just going to keep listening. And so maybe you say something like, well, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because you're not ready to stop listening. You have some more listening to do. Back channeling cues are things that you do like, oh, all right, wow. And what you do is you're basically showing that you are engaged in the conversation, you're paying attention, and you're following along with them. They can also be viewed as interruptions, but they're not an interruption because you're not jumping in and now delivering a whole message. You're just showing that you're paying attention. One thing I've learned over the years is that some people like no back channeling cues. They would rather you sit quietly and just nod your head, which is difficult to do if you're on a phone call. Other people like it when you say, oh my gosh, Women tend to give more back channeling cues than men, but I know men that give many as well. I can talk to my dad, and he does not like back channeling cues. It totally throws him for a loop. He wants me to sit quietly and look at him, just like I'm still 8 years old. My husband, however, likes lots of back channeling cues. If I don't say anything and I just look at him, he's like, are you listening? Or are you confused? So back channeling cues, be aware of the person that you're talking to. What do they prefer in terms of back channeling cues? The last principle I want to talk about is the principle of politeness. And that means that conversation is usually polite. We tend to like people that are polite and want to talk to people. And that means we follow 6 maxims. The first is the maxim of tact. And that means you help maintain the other's autonomy. And that's the negative face, that I don't mean to impose, but, or I know you're very busy, but. Saying things like that is going to be very tactful and polite. The maxim of generosity, it's to confirm the other person's importance, and that means that I value you, and you can say, hey, I see you're busy, I'll do this for you. The next is the maxim of approbation, and that refers to praising someone or complimenting the person. The next is the maxim of modesty. It minimizes praise or compliments you might receive. Well, thank you, but I couldn't have done it without your help. The maxim of agreement, it refers to you seeking out areas of agreement, and that may mean you may say, the color you selected was just right. It makes the room exciting. So you didn't like that color to begin with, but now you're saying, you know what, it makes the room much better. So we agree that the goal was to make the room better. It didn't really matter what color we chose. And then last but not least is the maxim of sympathy, and that refers to the expression of understanding. It's being empathetic, and it's saying, I understand your feelings, I'm so sorry, doing things that indicate we really care about the other person. So all of those maxims should be followed if we're going to follow the principle of politeness in our conversations, which hopefully we will do.